Chapter 1. Echoes of Yesterday. Sophie sat in the corner of the coffee shop, her fingers curled around the warm ceramic mug. The steam rose gently from the cup, and the quiet hum of conversation around her was like a distant murmur, a far-off symphony she had long learned to ignore. She hadn't come for the noise, though. The clatter of mugs, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of the barista's voice. Those were simply parts of the background, white noise in the larger symphony of her life. What she sought here, in this small, dimly lit corner, was the comfort of her own thoughts, the space to think and to breathe. The silence in the room was thick, yet Sophie had grown used to it. In fact, it was the very reason she had returned to this place every day for the last few months. There was something peaceful about the lack of expectation, about not having to fill the air with unnecessary words. She had learned long ago that not everything needed to be said. Sometimes, the most important things were the ones left unsaid. Her mind drifted as the minutes passed, her gaze settling on the windowsill outside, where the light of the setting sun cast a golden glow over the city. The shadows of passing pedestrians stretched long across the pavement, the world moving in its own quiet rhythm. She wondered how many of those strangers, who crossed her path for mere seconds, shared a similar sense of solitude. It was in the midst of these musings, this quiet contemplation, that he walked in. The door chimed softly, but Sophie barely registered it, her eyes still fixed on the street outside. It wasn't until she heard the rustling of a jacket and a quiet voice that she looked up. "Is this seat taken?" His voice was gentle, tentative. Sophie raised an eyebrow, unsure whether she had heard correctly, or whether the universe had just decided to play one of its little tricks on her. He was standing there, at the table opposite hers, looking at her with a gaze that was both curious and uncertain. "No," Sophie answered, her voice more clipped than she intended. She hadn't meant to sound dismissive, but there was something about his sudden presence that felt intrusive. She had come to this place for the quiet, the space to be alone with her thoughts, not to have her solitude interrupted by a stranger. Yet, she couldn't deny there was something about him that caught her attention. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to acknowledge her unease. He sat down slowly, carefully, as though testing the waters. Sophie couldn't help but watch him as he settled into the chair, his movements deliberate, measured. He didn't seem like someone who thrived on noise either. Maybe that was why she didn't mind his presence so much. Or maybe it was just the fact that she was used to the unexpected now, used to the way life had a habit of surprising her when she least expected it. For a while, neither of them spoke. The minutes passed like an endless stream of quiet, punctuated only by the occasional sip from their mugs or the sound of a cup being set down gently. Sophie found herself glancing at him from time to time, her curiosity piqued by his silence, the way he seemed perfectly content to simply exist in the moment. She couldn't quite place it, but there was something about him that felt familiar. Maybe it was the way he didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter, or the way his presence didn't demand her attention, yet somehow commanded it. There was an ease about him that Sophie couldn't explain, something she hadn't encountered in a long time. Finally, it was he who broke the silence. "You come here often?" His question was simple, but it felt like a lifeline, a way to bridge the space between them. Sophie tilted her head slightly, considering him. She wasn't one to make small talk, not anymore. But there was something about this moment, this quiet interaction, that felt different. Perhaps it was the way he asked, or perhaps it was the fact that she was just so starved for connection that her words slipped out without thought. "Yeah," she said softly, her gaze dropping to the mug in her hands. "I find it peaceful here. The noise doesn't reach me. It's quiet enough to think." He nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his own mug absent-mindedly. "I understand that. I like the quiet, too. It's Easier to listen to yourself when everything else fades away. Sophie looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was something in his gaze that resonated with her, a shared understanding that passed between them without a word. It was strange how the simplest of exchanges could feel like a moment of connection that reached deeper than anything either of them had ever experienced. They fell into another comfortable silence, the kind that was not awkward, not uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence where they could both exist, side by side, without the need for constant validation. It was a silence that felt like home. As the evening wore on and the cafe began to empty, Sophie realized that her time here was slipping away. She didn't know how long they had sat together, just the two of them in the corner, talking and not talking. But she felt it, this small, delicate shift in the air, the way something had changed between them in the quiet. There was a pull, an unspoken gravity that was drawing them closer together, despite the distance between their words. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt something stir within her. It wasn't love, at least, not yet, but it was something that she couldn't quite define. A flicker, a spark, something that made her wonder what would happen if she allowed herself to lean into the silence, to let it envelop her rather than retreat from it. As the clock on the wall ticked closer to closing time, Caleb stood up, pulling his coat over his shoulders with a fluid motion. He smiled at her once more, that same quiet, knowing smile, and Sophie found herself returning it without thinking. "It was nice meeting you," he said, his voice a soft murmur as he turned toward the door. "Maybe I'll see you here again?" Sophie's heart gave a little flutter, but she nodded. "Maybe." And just like that, he was gone, slipping out the door and into the evening, leaving Sophie with nothing but the sound of her own breath and the faintest echo of his presence still lingering in the air. For the rest of the night, she sat there, the empty cup in front of her growing cold, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite capture. The silence had returned, but this time, it felt different. It felt significant. And somehow, Sophie knew that this moment, this brief encounter, would leave an echo in her heart for days to come. Chapter 2: Shadows in the Spotlight. The days that followed their brief encounter felt like a slow unraveling, each moment drawing Sophie further into a web of questions she didn't know how to answer. She hadn't expected Caleb to linger in her thoughts as much as he did, but there he was, his quiet presence, his unspoken words, lingering like an aftertaste she couldn't quite shake off. She returned to the coffee shop the following afternoon, not necessarily hoping to see him again, but with a quiet curiosity that pulled her back. The same table, the same spot by the window. She settled into her corner, just as she always did, the soft murmur of conversation around her soothing her restless thoughts. The sun was lower now, the golden light filtering through the windows, painting the room in a soft, nostalgic glow. As Sophie sipped her coffee, her mind wandered to that brief moment they had shared. How easily they had fallen into silence, how natural it had felt to sit with him and say so little. There was something magnetic about him, something unspoken that hung between them, waiting for its turn to be acknowledged. But she had no idea how to navigate it. She wasn't used to letting people in, certainly not in a way that felt this unfamiliar, this vulnerable. A soft bell rang above the door, and Sophie's heart skipped, but she didn't look up. She didn't want to. She couldn't afford to get distracted, not when she was finally beginning to put her thoughts in order. But the footsteps that followed felt too deliberate, too close. And then that voice. "Mind if I join you?" It was him. Caleb. Sophie looked up slowly, her gaze meeting his with the same quiet acknowledgement that had passed between them the last time. This time, though, there was a subtle shift. It wasn't just a random encounter anymore. There was intention in his approach, something deliberate in the way he smiled before sitting down across from her. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, the words light, almost casual, but there was something deeper in his tone, something that made Sophie pause. How did you know? Sophie asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. It wasn't like her to ask something so personal, but something about him made her feel open, like the walls she had so carefully built around herself were starting to crack. He smiled again, that same knowing smile that made her heart race ever so slightly. I don't know. I guess I just felt like I'd find you here. It's like you're a part of this place, a part of the quiet. Sophie's brow furrowed. I don't think I'm a part of anything, she said softly, almost to herself. The words felt bitter as soon as they left her lips, but they were true. She had always felt like an outsider, like she was drifting through life without truly belonging anywhere or with anyone. Caleb's gaze softened, and for a moment, she swore she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Maybe that's what makes you special, he said quietly, the words carrying a weight she didn't fully understand. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say to that. Special? How could someone like her be special? She was just a woman who had built her life around silence, around staying unnoticed. She had perfected the art of being invisible, of letting the world move around her without ever truly engaging. But Caleb seemed to see through all of that, and that was the part that unsettled her. The room around them buzzed with the hum of conversation, but to Sophie, it all felt distant. Caleb was here, sitting across from her, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. And as much as she wanted to retreat back into her quiet corner, something kept her rooted to the spot. She was no longer alone in her thoughts. There was something about Caleb that made her question the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. For a while, they didn't speak. They just sat there, letting the silence hang between them like a delicate thread. It was different from the silence of before. This time, it wasn't just Sophie alone in her thoughts. It was shared, two souls existing in the same space, neither rushing to fill the quiet. It was a silence that felt like a kind of understanding, a tacit agreement that neither of them needed to speak to be heard. Finally, Caleb broke the quiet. But this time, it wasn't a question. It was an invitation. Tell me about yourself, he said, his voice steady, his gaze never wavering. You come here all the time, and yet I know nothing about you. What's your story? Sophie froze, her hand halfway to her cup. It was as if the world had paused, the question hanging in the air, waiting for an answer that Sophie wasn't ready to give. She wasn't used to talking about herself, not to strangers, not to anyone. It was easier to listen, to observe, to remain the quiet observer in her own life. But there was something in his eyes, a kindness, an understanding that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, like maybe it was okay to be seen. I'm not sure there's much to tell, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. I work, I come here, I keep to myself. There isn't much to it. My life, it's just noise really. Noise I don't always know how to escape. Caleb listened, his gaze fixed on her, as if he were savoring her words, even the ones that felt empty to her. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the space with reassurances or advice. He just let her speak, let her find the rhythm of her thoughts in her own time. After a moment, he nodded. Maybe we all live in a kind of noise we don't know how to silence, he said softly. But sometimes, the quiet is just what we need to hear what's been there all along. Sophie looked at him, his words settling in her chest like a soft echo. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he seemed to understand the unspoken, that made her want to trust him, even though she wasn't sure she was ready to. I don't know how to do that, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb smiled, a quiet, reassuring smile that made Sophie's heart flutter. You don't have to figure it out all at once. Sometimes, just being here is enough. Sophie nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to be present in the moment. She let the silence between them stretch out, not as something uncomfortable, but as something shared, something she could learn to embrace. As the hours passed and the coffee shop began to empty, Sophie found herself lingering. She didn't want to leave just yet, not when she felt like she was on the edge of something new, something that might just pull her out of the silence she had been living in for so long. Caleb stood up eventually, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he didn't want to disrupt the fragile connection they had built in the space of a few quiet hours. He smiled at her one last time before turning to leave, his figure disappearing out the door as quietly as he had arrived. Sophie remained at the table, her thoughts swirling in a way they hadn't in a long time. There was something different about him, something that made her want to understand, and as she left the coffee shop, the world outside seemed a little less lonely, a little less silent. Chapter 3: The Silent Overture. Sophie had always believed in the quiet, the kind of silence that was empty yet full, the kind that enveloped her like a comforting blanket. She found refuge in it, hiding away from the world in its soft embrace. It was her choice, her way of existing in a world that often seemed too loud, too fast, too demanding. But as the days passed after Caleb's unexpected reappearance in her life, Sophie began to feel a pull. Something subtle, like the first notes of a song that slowly began to crescendo, threatening to break the silence she had so carefully built. The next few days were a blur of routine, the hum of daily life going on as it always had. Work, errands, quiet evenings at home with nothing but the sound of the wind outside to keep her company. But Sophie found herself thinking about Caleb more than she cared to admit. She wondered if he was thinking about her too, though she quickly dismissed the thought. After all, it was just a brief encounter, nothing more. People like her didn't have stories like the ones you read in books. They didn't get to live in the quiet beauty of connection. They existed, and that was enough. But Caleb's words, his presence, those things lingered, lingering in the corners of her mind like a melody she couldn't forget. She wondered why he had come to the coffee shop that day, why he had chosen her to sit with, to speak to. What had he seen in her that made him want to stay, to listen, to understand? The thoughts swirled in her mind until one afternoon, when she found herself standing at the door of the same coffee shop, her hand hovering over the handle. For the first time, she hesitated. The familiar comfort of the place, the soothing hum of the world around her, seemed to offer something different now, something she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. Was it possible that Caleb had already become part of her world in ways she didn't understand? But before she could retreat into the safety of her own quiet space, the door swung open, and there he was. "Hey," Caleb said softly, his voice carrying the same calm assurance as always. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Sophie felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite place. A feeling that was both exciting and unsettling, as if she had been waiting for this moment without even realizing it. "Hi," she responded, her voice quieter than she intended. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to navigate the unexpected path this connection seemed to be taking. Caleb smiled gently, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. He gestured to the empty chair at her table. "Mind if I join you again?" Sophie paused, her thoughts momentarily racing. She wasn't sure if she wanted him there, if she was ready to invite this uncharted territory into her life. But the truth was, she didn't want him to leave either. The silence between them felt different now, charged with an energy she didn't understand. So, without another word, she nodded. "Sure," she said, and in that single word, she felt something shift, a subtle acknowledgement that this moment, however brief, was important, that she was allowing something new to seep into the quiet spaces she had carefully constructed. As Caleb settled into the seat across from her, Sophie couldn't help but notice the way the room felt different. The same sounds, the same muted light filtering through the windows, but it all seemed brighter somehow, more alive. There was a subtle vibrancy in the air, as though the very silence that had once been her refuge was now beginning to speak to her in ways she hadn't expected. "I thought about what you said last time," Caleb began, his voice low and steady, breaking through the quiet like the first note of a song. "About the noise we don't know how to silence." Sophie looked at him, intrigued. She hadn't expected him to bring it up, hadn't expected him to remember. But there he was, drawing out the words she had left unsaid, as if he had understood the depth of the silence she had tried so hard to keep hidden. "You said you didn't know how to silence it," he continued, his gaze soft but intense. "But maybe the real question is, why do we try to silence it in the first place?" Sophie felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. She wasn't sure how to respond, wasn't sure how to unravel the tangle of thoughts in her mind. The truth was, she had spent so much of her life trying to block out the noise, trying to protect herself from the chaos of the world. But Caleb's question made her wonder if that had been the right choice. What if the noise wasn't something to be avoided, but something to be understood? "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's easier to shut it out, to pretend it doesn't exist." Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But that doesn't make it go away, does it?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. She just stared into the depths of her coffee cup, watching the ripples in the liquid, the small reflections that danced on the surface. She knew Caleb was right. She had spent years trying to escape the noise in her own mind, trying to escape the things she didn't want to confront. But it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for her to acknowledge it. The silence between them stretched again, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with possibility. Sophie realized that with Caleb, the silence didn't have to be something to fear. It could be a space to discover something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to explore before. "You don't have to explain it all at once," Caleb said, his voice soft, reassuring. "I just think sometimes the silence isn't something we need to run from. Maybe it's something we need to listen to let it show us what's been hiding there all along." Sophie looked up at him then, meeting his eyes. There was something in his gaze that made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't felt in years. He wasn't asking for answers, wasn't pushing her to speak or to open up before she was ready. He was simply offering a space for her to exist in, a space where she didn't have to pretend to be anything other than what she was. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said softly, the words carrying the weight of everything she had kept locked away for so long. "But maybe I'm starting to understand why it's worth considering." Caleb smiled then, a quiet, understanding smile that made something flutter inside Sophie's chest. "You don't have to be ready all at once. Life doesn't work like that. We take it one step at a time." Sophie nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't a promise of change, not yet, but for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of it. That maybe, just maybe, there was something worth listening to in the silence. The evening stretched on, and Sophie found herself lingering once again, lost in conversation and in the comfortable presence of Caleb. The world outside continued to spin, but here, in this small corner of the coffee shop, they existed together in a quiet understanding. There were no grand declarations, no promises made, just two people learning to listen to the unspoken language between them, letting the silence guide them into something new. And in that moment, Sophie couldn't help but wonder, maybe the real sound of silence wasn't the absence of noise. Maybe it was the beginning of something more, something she hadn't yet been brave enough to name. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Dark. The days after their quiet meeting seemed to stretch on like the soft rhythm of a song, one that Sophie hadn't yet learned to dance to but felt drawn toward, nonetheless. Caleb's presence lingered, a gentle hum at the back of her mind, an unspoken invitation she hadn't fully accepted but didn't want to decline either. Life had returned to its usual pace, work, errands, the same familiar routines. But there was something different now. The world felt a little more open, as though the silence she'd held so tightly had begun to loosen its grip, revealing the possibility of something more. It was late when Sophie left work one evening. The city streets bathed in the cool blue light of a setting sun. The world was quieter than usual, as if the city itself had settled into a moment of peace, and Sophie welcomed the stillness. The days had grown longer, the evenings warmer, and though she had once relished the solitude of her walks, tonight felt different. Tonight, it was as if every step she took was leading her somewhere, though she wasn't sure where that was. As she walked past the familiar landmarks of the city, a part of her wondered if she would find herself at the coffee shop again. She had told herself she wouldn't return. It was too much, too fast, and she wasn't someone who easily let herself fall into the kind of connection that Caleb offered. But still, she found her feet carrying her toward the shop, the familiar door inviting her inside like an old friend. The moment she stepped inside, the warmth of the coffee shop enveloped her, and for a moment, Sophie felt a sense of calm, the kind of quiet that made everything else fade into the background. She glanced around, almost absent-mindedly, and then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, her eyes landed on him. Caleb was sitting at the same table, the one by the window, looking out into the street. He hadn't noticed her yet, his focus entirely on the world outside. But there was something different in the way he sat, the way the light caught the sharp angles of his face, the way the air around him seemed to hum with a quiet intensity. It was as though he was waiting for something or someone. And Sophie realized, with a start, that she had become part of that waiting. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to approach. But before she could make up her mind, Caleb's gaze shifted, meeting hers across the room. His eyes softened with that familiar, knowing warmth, and he smiled. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle, the word almost like a secret shared between them. Sophie felt a strange flutter in her chest, something she hadn't expected. She had known, deep down, that he would be here. There was an unspoken pull between them, a quiet understanding that had woven its way into the fabric of her days. She had tried to deny it, tried to convince herself that it was just a fleeting encounter. But now, in the quiet of the coffee shop, with Caleb looking at her like he had been waiting for her, Sophie felt the truth of it settle in her bones. "Hi," she replied, her voice soft but steady, the words carrying more weight than she had intended. She stepped forward, as though the space between them had finally grown small enough to cross. Caleb shifted slightly in his seat, making room for her, and Sophie took the seat across from him, her heart beating a little faster than she was used to. The silence between them was different now, charged with anticipation, a sense of something unfolding that neither of them fully understood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was the kind of silence that seemed to hum with possibility, like the air before a storm, heavy with something unspoken but present. "I didn't expect you to come back," Caleb said quietly, his eyes fixed on hers. There was a vulnerability in his voice, a hint of uncertainty that Sophie hadn't expected. It made her want to reach across the table, to erase the distance between them, but she held herself back. "I didn't either," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure why she was being so honest with him, why the words came so easily when she had always been so guarded, so careful. But with Caleb, it was different. He didn't demand her truth. He simply gave her the space to find it on her own. Caleb smiled faintly, his gaze softening. "I'm glad you did. I thought, maybe I'd never see you again." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that made Sophie's breath catch in her throat. It was strange, the way he said it, like he had been holding on to that thought, that hope, since the first time they'd met. It made Sophie wonder if she had somehow become a part of his life, even in the brief time they had shared. "I didn't think I was someone worth seeing again," Sophie said. her words tumbling out before she could stop them. She wasn't sure why she had said it, or why it felt so important to voice this quiet insecurity that had always lingered in her. Caleb's gaze grew serious, and he leaned forward slightly, as if trying to reach her through the space between them. "You are," he said simply, his voice steady. "You're more than worth it. You just don't know it yet." Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth she wasn't sure she knew how to handle. It was so easy to stay hidden, to remain in the shadows, to avoid the possibility of disappointment. But Caleb's words, their quiet intimacy, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Before she could respond, a soft whisper interrupted them. It was the gentle clink of a spoon against a cup, the soft murmur of voices nearby, but there was something more to it. Sophie turned her head, her gaze sweeping over the room, but no one seemed to be paying them any special attention. Yet, in the corner of her mind, a strange unease began to stir, a whisper that wasn't hers but felt too close, too real. Caleb noticed her distraction. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice suddenly full of concern. He followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the usual patrons of the coffee shop, lost in their own worlds. Sophie shook her head, trying to push the feeling aside. It wasn't real, she told herself. It was just the weight of everything she was feeling, everything she was trying to avoid. But the sensation, the sense that someone was watching her, waiting, lingered. "Nothing," she said finally, her voice steadier now. I think I'm just tired." Caleb's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't press her. Instead, he simply nodded, offering her a quiet smile. "You don't have to talk about it, but if you ever do, I'm here." Sophie nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. The words were comforting, but they also felt like a promise she wasn't sure she was ready to keep. There was something about Caleb that made her want to open up, to let him in, but the darkness, the whispers, lingered in the back of her mind, a reminder of the things she wasn't ready to face. As the evening wore on, the coffee shop grew quieter, the once bustling room settling into the calm of the night. The whispers in Sophie's mind didn't fade, but she found herself focused on Caleb, on the quiet space between them, on the possibility of something more than the silence she had clung to for so long. For the first time in a long time, Sophie allowed herself to consider the idea that perhaps the silence wasn't something to be afraid of. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new, something she hadn't yet been brave enough to name. Chapter 5. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The days had begun to blend together. Sophie couldn't quite place when it happened, but somewhere between the quiet conversations and the silences that spoke louder than words, something inside her shifted. The weight of the unspoken words that had once held her in place had begun to loosen its grip. Yet, the more she tried to embrace it, the heavier it felt. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Caleb's face, that soft smile that felt both like a question and an answer. His words from the phone call echoed in her mind. "I don't think silence is the answer, Sophie. Not anymore." He hadn't pressed her for an answer, hadn't asked her to explain herself, but the gravity of his voice, the tenderness of his understanding, lingered in the air. His words had cracked open a door she had long kept shut, and now, she wasn't sure how to close it again. The mornings had become increasingly difficult for Sophie. The weight of the day ahead, the uncertainty that clouded her every step, felt overwhelming. It wasn't that she was afraid of what she might find if she allowed herself to feel. She was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. If she allowed the silence to consume her again, to pull her back into the comfortable solitude that had kept her safe for so long. But there was Caleb, his quiet persistence, the way he seemed to understand her without saying a word, was a constant reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was something more waiting for her. Still, Sophie couldn't shake the fear that followed her like a shadow. She wasn't sure if it was the fear of letting herself get too close, or the fear of the unknown, of what the silence between them truly meant. She was sitting at her desk, her eyes scanning the pages in front of her, but not really reading them. The words blurred together, nothing more than shapes on a page. Her mind kept drifting back to Caleb. She had seen him a few times since that night at the coffee shop, but each time felt like a new chapter, a new beginning that she wasn't sure she was ready for. Each encounter left her with more questions than answers. Was this something real? Or was it just a fleeting moment, a brief connection that would fade as quickly as it had appeared? She had been avoiding the answer, hoping that time would give her clarity, but the more she tried to push it away, the more it seemed to loom over her. Sophie. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft voice of her coworker, Emily. Sophie looked up, blinking as she returned to the present. "Sorry, I was somewhere else," Sophie said with a small smile, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Emily raised an eyebrow. "I can tell. You've been out of it all week. You okay?" Sophie hesitated. She hadn't been sure how to explain to anyone what was going on inside her. She wasn't sure she even understood it herself. It was more than just the usual work stress. It was something deeper, something that was both pulling her forward and holding her back at the same time. "I'm fine," Sophie replied, her voice lighter than she felt. "Just thinking about some things." Emily smiled knowingly. "Well, if you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Sophie nodded, grateful for her friend's concern, but she didn't have the words to explain the turmoil inside her. She wasn't even sure if she wanted to. She had always been good at keeping things to herself, at keeping her feelings locked away behind a wall of silence. But lately, that wall had been cracking, and she wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work and distractions, but Sophie couldn't escape the thought of Caleb. Her phone had remained silent, no new messages or calls. She knew she should be grateful for the space, for the time to breathe and think without the pressure of answering, but instead, she felt a growing sense of unease. The silence was becoming harder to bear. The longer they went without speaking, the more the distance between them seemed to stretch, even if neither of them had said anything to make it feel that way. When she got home that evening, Sophie threw her keys on the kitchen counter and collapsed onto the couch. She closed her eyes, willing the exhaustion to settle in. But it was the silence of the room that felt the most overwhelming. The silence of her own thoughts, the weight of the words that she hadn't spoken, all pressing in on her, suffocating her. The phone in her pocket buzzed, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a message from Caleb. "Hey, hope your day went well. I've been thinking about you." The words were simple, but they hit Sophie harder than she expected. He had been thinking about her, and maybe she had been thinking about him too. But the thought of answering, of opening that door wider, felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. She wanted to reach out, wanted to let herself connect, but the fear of what that might mean held her back. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. What did he want from her? Was it just a moment of curiosity, or was there something deeper beneath the surface? She wanted to tell him that she was thinking about him too, but the words felt too heavy, too loaded. Instead, she typed a simple response, the kind of reply that kept things safe, kept everything in the realm of the comfortable silence that she had known for so long. "Thank you. My day was good." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then placed the phone face down on the coffee table. The silence that followed felt deafening, a stark reminder of the space between them that neither of them seemed brave enough to cross. It wasn't that Sophie didn't want to connect with Caleb. She did. She had wanted it from the moment they met. But the weight of her own insecurities, the fear of what it might mean to truly let him in, was too much to bear. The words she didn't say piled up inside her, heavy and suffocating. And every time she thought about letting him into the quiet of her world, she found herself retreating into the safety of the silence she had always known. The phone buzzed again, but this time, Sophie didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she sat in the quiet, feeling the weight of the unspoken between them, wondering how much longer she could keep it all in. How much longer could she ignore the pull of her own heart? Finally, she picked up the phone. The message was short and simple. "I miss talking to you." And just like that, the weight of her silence broke a little more. The words she hadn't spoken, the things she had kept hidden, suddenly felt closer than ever before. Chapter 6: A World Without Sound. Sophie had always believed that silence could be peaceful, a sanctuary from the noise of the world. But lately, it felt more like a prison. Each moment spent in the quiet of her apartment seemed to close in around her, pressing against her chest with a suffocating weight. She had grown used to being alone, to the stillness that accompanied her every thought, every action. But now, the silence felt like an insurmountable wall that separated her from everything she yearned to understand about herself, about Caleb, about the unspoken connection that had begun to bloom between them. The city outside her window hummed with life, a constant stream of sound that seemed to mock her own quiet existence. People passed by on the sidewalks, their voices rising and falling in the rhythm of the day. But Sophie felt as though she were in another world entirely, a world without sound, without the urgency of human connection. The disconnect was jarring. So much noise in the world, and yet, she felt as if she were floating in an ocean of silence. It was the morning after she had received Caleb's message. The words, "I miss talking to you," still lingered in her mind, echoing like a whisper in the empty room. She had been staring at the message for what felt like hours, unsure of how to respond, unsure of what to say that wouldn't expose the vulnerability she had spent so long hiding. There was so much she wanted to tell him, so much she wanted to share, but it felt like trying to speak underwater. Everything was muffled, distorted, lost in the depths of her own uncertainty. Sophie sat at her kitchen table, the mug of coffee before her growing cold as she absent-mindedly stirred it. Her fingers tapped on the edge of the mug, a quiet rhythm of their own, a beat that felt disconnected from everything around her. She had always been a creature of habit, finding comfort in the small routines that filled her days. But lately, the routines had begun to feel hollow, like they were just distractions from the things she couldn't face. Her phone sat on the table, a constant reminder of the silence that had settled between her and Caleb. She had left his message unanswered, unsure of what would happen if she opened that door, if she allowed herself to acknowledge what she was beginning to feel. She was terrified, terrified of what would happen if she let him in, terrified of what it would mean for her carefully constructed world to shift, to change. She wasn't sure if she could bear the weight of it all, the closeness, the rawness of connection that seemed to have come so effortlessly between them. But it wasn't just Caleb that Sophie was avoiding. It was herself. It was the realization that she had been hiding behind walls of silence for so long, afraid of facing the mess of emotions she had buried deep within her. She had spent years convincing herself that she was fine, that she didn't need anyone, that the silence was a choice, a path to peace. But now, as the weight of everything she had kept inside her pressed against her chest, Sophie couldn't escape the truth. The silence had never been a sanctuary. It had been a shield, one that protected her from the things she feared the most, the vulnerability, the hurt, the love. She had always believed that love was something distant, something intangible, something she didn't deserve. She had seen it in others, in fleeting moments of connection between friends, between strangers, but she had never believed it could be hers. And now, with Caleb's words, his quiet understanding, she wasn't sure what to do with the feelings that had begun to stir inside her. Was this love? Or was it something else? Something simpler? Something easier to deny? Her phone buzzed again, breaking her from her thoughts. Sophie picked it up, her heart racing as she saw Caleb's name on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? Her voice was shaky, the words coming out softer than she had intended. Hey, it's me, Caleb said, his voice warm, but tinged with uncertainty. I didn't mean to disturb you. I just wanted to see how you're doing. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat tight. I'm fine, she replied, though the words didn't quite match how she felt. She didn't want to admit to him, to anyone, that she wasn't fine, that she was struggling with the weight of emotions that had come out of nowhere, emotions that she didn't know how to handle. There was a brief silence on the other end, and Sophie could almost hear Caleb trying to find the right words. You don't have to lie, Sophie, he said softly. I can hear it in your voice. You're not fine, and it's okay. You don't have to be. Her chest tightened at his words. How could he hear it? How could he know, with just a few words, that she wasn't okay? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized it was the quiet things that spoke the loudest between them. The pauses, the hesitations, the way their words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. He wasn't trying to force her to open up. He was just there, waiting, understanding without pushing. I don't know what to say, Sophie confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I'm doing. You don't have to know right now, Caleb replied gently. We don't have to have all the answers. We can just be. The simplicity of his words struck her like a chord, resonating deep within her. Be, Sophie echoed, unsure of what it meant, unsure if she was ready to let go of the fear that had held her so tightly. Yeah, Caleb said, a small chuckle in his voice. Just be. No pressure. No expectations. Just us, figuring things out together, one step at a time. Sophie closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe. Like it was okay to not have all the answers. Like it was okay to not know exactly what was going to happen next. She didn't have to have everything figured out. All she had to do was take that next step, however small it might be. I think I'd like that, Sophie said, her voice barely audible, but filled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with the weight of unspoken words. It was a different kind of silence, one that felt like a promise, like the beginning of something new. For the first time in ages, Sophie didn't feel like she was in a world without sound. She felt like she was finally beginning to listen. To Caleb, to herself, to the quiet spaces between them that were no longer just filled with emptiness, but with the possibility of something more. Chapter 7. The Language of Light. The world had always been full of noise for Sophie, noise she had long retreated from, choosing instead the silence that enveloped her like a cloak. But now, it was the light that seemed to beckon her, pulling her forward, urging her to step beyond the confines of her self-imposed isolation. The light was not just the warm glow of the sun on a lazy afternoon or the soft illumination of her apartment at night. It was something deeper, something that felt as though it spoke directly to her soul. It was the language of connection, of understanding, and for the first time in her life, Sophie was learning to listen to it. The first time she noticed the light in this way was during a walk in the park. It had been a few days since her conversation with Caleb, and the weight of the unspoken words had finally started to lift. There was a lightness in the air that morning, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sophie had stepped outside, not knowing exactly where her feet would lead her, but trusting that she needed to be in the world again, to witness it, to feel it. The park was quiet, unusual for a Saturday morning, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. Sophie breathed in the fresh air, letting it fill her lungs, feeling the tension of the past weeks begin to fade. She didn't realize how much she had been holding her breath until she finally exhaled, the world around her seeming to shift into sharper focus. As she walked, Her thoughts kept returning to Caleb. He had become a constant presence in her mind, his voice like a soft melody in the background of her life. The vulnerability she had felt in their last conversation still lingered, but it no longer felt like something to be feared. His words had unlocked something inside her, something that had been buried for too long. She could still feel the warmth of his presence, even in the quiet of her own thoughts. She wandered to the edge of the park, where a small pond reflected the blue sky above. The water was still, like glass, and the trees surrounding it stood like silent sentinels, their branches gently swaying in the breeze. Sophie found a bench by the water and sat down, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the noise of the world around her, but to the deeper rhythm of it, the sound of the wind, the rustling of leaves, the quiet pulse of life. It was then that she felt it, the light. It was not something she could see with her eyes, but something she could feel in the air around her. It wrapped around her like a soft embrace, and in that moment, Sophie understood that this was the language Caleb had been speaking. He hadn't used words to reach her, not really. He had used his presence, his quiet understanding, his willingness to sit with her in the silence, to let her be. She had spent so long trying to avoid the weight of emotions, of connection, of love, but now she was beginning to see that the light, the warmth, the openness, was the language of all those things. It was in the way Caleb had listened to her, in the way he had been patient with her silences. He had never forced her to speak, never demanded anything from her except that she be herself, and in return, he had shown her that it was okay to be vulnerable, to share the unspoken things that lived inside her. Sophie stood up from the bench, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She walked slowly along the path, her thoughts swirling around the realization that had just taken root in her chest. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know what would happen next. All she needed to do was be present, to allow herself to feel the light, to let it guide her as she had allowed the silence to guide her for so long. When she returned home later that afternoon, the apartment felt different somehow. The shadows that had once seemed oppressive now seemed softer, as if the very walls had absorbed the light she had carried with her. She sat down at her desk, her fingers hovering over her phone as she stared at the screen. Caleb's name was still there, waiting. She had wanted to reach out to him, wanted to tell him how much his words had meant to her, how much they had helped her see beyond the walls she had built around herself. But now, more than anything, Sophie realized that words were no longer enough. Words were limited, fragile things, and they could never truly capture what she felt. There had to be more than just words. There had to be the language of light. She sent him a message, but this time, it was different. There were no questions, no doubts, just the truth. I don't have all the answers, Caleb, but I think I'm starting to understand. I think I'm starting to listen. It was a small thing, a simple message, but for Sophie, it felt like the beginning of something new. The weight of the silence between them no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a shared space, a place where they could both just be. She didn't need to speak every word, to explain everything. She just needed to be present, to feel the connection between them, to let the light of their understanding wash over her. As the evening drew on, Sophie stood by her window, gazing out at the city below. The lights of the street lamps flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow across the buildings. It wasn't the harsh light of the sun, but something gentler, something that seemed to speak to her in a language beyond words. It was the light of possibility, the light of new beginnings, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie allowed herself to believe in it. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know what the future held. All she needed to do was step forward, trusting in the light, trusting in the language that spoke through every gesture, every touch, every quiet moment of connection. And with that, Sophie felt the last of the walls around her heart begin to crumble. The light was there, waiting, and she was ready to embrace it. Chapter 8. Fingers That Sing. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the room. There was a stillness in the air, one that felt unfamiliar to Sophie. It was the kind of quiet that came after something important had been said or felt, the kind that lingers even when no one speaks. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, as if expecting the silence to give her the answers she needed. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, emotions she hadn't expected, moments that had caught her off guard. But now, in this moment of stillness, Sophie felt an uneasy calm. Her thoughts drifted back to the night before, to the conversation with Caleb that had left her heart beating wildly in her chest. They had talked, but more than that, they had connected. For the first time in a long while, Sophie didn't feel like she was merely existing. She felt like she was seen. But the question remained, what did that connection mean? Was it fleeting? Was it enough to bridge the gap between her past and the life she wanted? Her heart wanted to believe in the possibilities, in the idea that maybe this was the beginning of something beautiful. But her mind, ever the skeptic, couldn't shake the doubts. Could they really make it work? Was it enough to want something if the world around them wasn't ready to give it? She sat up, running her fingers through her hair, trying to gather her thoughts. The apartment felt strangely empty, even though Caleb had left only a few hours ago. She had been so caught up in the whirlwind of emotions, in the tenderness of his touch and the softness of his words, that she hadn't noticed how much he had become a part of her life in such a short time. It wasn't just the physical closeness. It was something deeper, something intangible that had settled into her soul. The sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen broke her reverie. Sophie stood, stretching her arms above her head, and made her way to the small kitchen. She needed coffee, needed the comforting routine of making it, the warmth of the cup in her hands. As she poured the steaming liquid into her favorite mug, she felt the weight of the decisions ahead. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to find out. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She reached for it absent-mindedly and saw a message from Caleb. "I was thinking about last night. I'm glad we talked. I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes." Sophie smiled softly, a warmth blooming in her chest. There was no pressure in his words, just a quiet certainty. She found herself hoping that the connection they had started would be enough to overcome whatever obstacles lay ahead. She quickly typed a response. "Me too. I don't know where this is headed, but I'm glad we're on this journey together." As she hit send, the sound of her phone buzzing again made her look down. It was another message from Caleb. "Whatever comes, I'll be right here." Sophie's heart fluttered at his words, the simplicity of them bringing her comfort. In a world where everything felt uncertain, where nothing ever seemed to stay the same, Caleb's presence felt like a constant. And for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it could be enough. She took a sip of her coffee, staring out the window as the city came to life. People walked by on the street below, lost in their own worlds. But Sophie felt a strange sense of peace in knowing that, at least for this moment, her world had shifted. There was a chance, a glimmer of something new on the horizon. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Caleb's name on the screen. "Hey," she answered, her voice soft. "Hey," he replied, his tone light, but there was something deeper underneath it. "I know it's early, but I couldn't stop thinking about you." Sophie felt her cheeks warm, her heart racing. "What's on your mind?" "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice earnest, "for letting me in, for giving this a chance." Sophie smiled, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I'm the one who should be thanking you." There was a brief pause before Caleb spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know where this is going, but I want to find out with you." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had known, deep down, that this was the beginning of something. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the certainty in his voice, made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something beautiful. "I'd like that too," she whispered, her heart full. For a moment, they said nothing more. There was no need for words. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with promise. As Sophie finished her coffee and hung up the phone, she felt a shift within herself. There was still uncertainty, still fear, but there was also something stronger. Something that told her that no matter what came next, she wasn't alone. They were in this together. And that, for now, was enough. Chapter 9. Resonance in the Void. The days that followed were a strange mix of moments that felt too fast and others that seemed to stretch out endlessly. Sophie had always been someone who preferred stability, the quiet predictability of life. But lately, the world around her had been anything but predictable. It was a dance of emotions, a series of steps she wasn't sure how to follow. Every time she thought she had a handle on it, something new would shift, throwing her off balance. She sat at her desk that afternoon, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. There was a heaviness in the air, one that had nothing to do with her work and everything to do with the growing uncertainty in her heart. She had never been one to question her instincts, but now, with Caleb in her life, she was constantly wondering if she was making the right choices. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw Caleb's name. For a split second, her heart skipped a beat, and then she realized it was just a message. "I was thinking of you. Want to grab dinner tonight? I miss you." Sophie smiled softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug absent-mindedly. It had been days since they had spent time together, both of them caught up in their own lives. But this message, it was like a reminder of the space between them, the way everything felt suspended when they weren't together. She typed a response quickly. "I'd love that. I miss you too." The message sent with a soft tap, and she felt the familiar warmth that came with knowing Caleb was thinking of her, wanting to spend time with her. There was something about the way he made her feel, like she was seen in a way that no one had ever really seen her before. But as the minutes ticked by, the warmth began to fade, replaced by a lingering doubt. Sophie leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen, as the quiet hum of the office around her filled the space. It was silly, really, to feel unsure. Caleb was clear with her. He wanted this. He wanted her. And yet, there was a part of Sophie that couldn't quiet the voice that whispered in the back of her mind. Was it enough? Was it enough to let go of the past, to trust that this was real, that this was what she had been waiting for all along? She stood up abruptly, pushing the thoughts away. It was a beautiful evening, the sun setting behind the skyline, casting the city in a soft golden light. She grabbed her coat and left the office, walking briskly down the sidewalk toward the restaurant where she and Caleb had agreed to meet. The air was cooler than she expected, but the sharp bite of it felt good, like it might shake her from the spiral of her thoughts. When she arrived, she spotted Caleb immediately. He was sitting at a small table near the window, his gaze fixed on his phone, though he looked up the moment she entered. His face lit up when he saw her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Sophie's heart fluttered at the sight of him, that familiar warmth returning in an instant. "Hey," she said, her voice light, though she couldn't quite shake the unease lingering beneath the surface. "Hey," Caleb replied, standing to pull out the chair for her. "You look beautiful." Sophie smiled, the compliment settling over her like a blanket, but it didn't quite reach the corners of her eyes. She sat down, feeling the distance between them grow, not physically, but emotionally. It was as if the quiet tension that had been building between them was finally breaking through, demanding to be acknowledged. They exchanged small talk at first. "How was your day?" What did you have for lunch? It was familiar, easy, but Sophie couldn't ignore the feeling that they were both dancing around something unspoken. The waitress came by to take their order, and after a few moments of deliberation, they both settled on pasta. But as she left, Caleb leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Something's different, isn't it?" he asked, his gaze searching her face. Sophie blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know how to explain the mess of emotions swirling inside her, how she felt both closer to him than ever and yet, somehow, distant. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. Instead, she found herself just looking at him, at the way his brows furrowed slightly, the concern evident in his eyes. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I'm scared, Caleb." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes softening as he studied her. It wasn't pity she saw in his gaze, but understanding, as if he knew exactly what she meant. Slowly, he reached across the table, his hand brushing lightly against hers, a simple gesture, but one that held so much weight. "Scared of what?" he asked gently. Sophie exhaled, feeling the knot in her chest loosen ever so slightly. "Scared of how much this means, scared of how much I feel for you. I've never felt this before, and it terrifies me." Caleb's hand tightened around hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in slow, soothing circles. "I get it," he said quietly. "I'm scared too. But that's okay, Sophie. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to trust that we're in this together." Sophie felt the weight of his words sink in. There was truth in them, in the quiet reassurance that maybe they didn't need to figure everything out in one night. They had time to navigate the space between them, to close the gap that had seemed so vast before. For the first time in days, Sophie felt a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from certainty, but the kind that came from knowing she wasn't alone in her fear, that Caleb was there, ready to face whatever came next with her. Their dinner arrived soon after, and the conversation flowed more easily, the tension easing as they fell into a comfortable rhythm. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt like that was enough. Chapter 10. The Crescendo of Silence. The morning sunlight spilled through the window, soft and gentle, yet persistent enough to tug Sophie from the depths of sleep. She stretched, feeling the cool sheets against her skin, and for a moment, she let herself bask in the quiet serenity of the morning. It had been a few days since that dinner with Caleb, and while the memory still lingered, she could feel the shift inside her. It wasn't just the comfort of his presence. It was something deeper, something that both exhilarated and terrified her. She pushed herself up from the bed and pulled her robe around her shoulders. The apartment was still, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant sound of cars outside. Sophie moved toward the kitchen, her thoughts wandering back to the night they had spent together. They had talked, laughed, and shared stories, but there had been a silence between them that spoke volumes. It was as though they were both holding something back, some deeper truth they weren't ready to face. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her pulse quickening as she saw Caleb's name on the screen. "Good morning. I was thinking of you. I hope your day's off to a good start." A small smile tugged at her lips as she read the message. Caleb had a way of making her feel like she was the center of his world without even trying. And yet, there was always that sense of something unspoken between them, a quiet undercurrent of fear and anticipation. Sophie typed back quickly, "Good morning to you too. It's going well so far. I've been thinking about you too." She paused for a moment before adding a second message. "Do you want to meet up later?" Her fingers hesitated above the keyboard as she wondered if she was moving too fast. There had been a sense of ease between them, a comfort that grew with every passing day, but sometimes Sophie wondered if it was all too much too soon. She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Her phone buzzed again, almost immediately. "I'd love that. How about this afternoon? I'll text you when I'm free." Sophie felt her heart give a little leap, excitement bubbling up inside her. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was a pull between them, something magnetic. Every time they were apart, it felt like a piece of her was missing. But when they were together, everything just seemed to make sense, if only for a little while. She spent the morning getting ready, trying to focus on the small tasks that filled her day. Making coffee, tidying up the apartment, organizing papers that had piled up. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting back to Caleb. The idea of seeing him again, of spending another afternoon in his company, felt like a promise of something deeper, something that was beginning to feel like more than just an attraction. It wasn't until noon that Caleb finally texted her. "I'm free now. How about we meet at the park? I know a spot that's quiet, just the right place to talk." Sophie's stomach fluttered at the thought of a quiet afternoon with him. It felt different from their usual dates, less formal, more intimate in its simplicity. She quickly typed back her agreement, eager to see him, to explore whatever this growing connection between them might be. It didn't take long for them to meet up. The park was just a short walk from her apartment, and Sophie found Caleb standing by a large oak tree when she arrived, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes scanning the crowd of people enjoying the sunny day. When he spotted her, his face broke into a smile that sent a rush of warmth through her. "Hey," he said, his voice light, but there was an undertone of something more. Something unspoken, like he too was aware of the shift between them. "Hey," Sophie replied, walking toward him, her steps slow and measured, as though she was trying to figure out what to say, how to fill the space between them. Without saying another word, Caleb reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant, like an unspoken agreement between them, a silent promise that they were both willing to step into whatever came next. They walked side by side through the park, the grass beneath their feet soft and cool, the air filled with the sounds of children playing, birds singing, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Sophie let herself be enveloped in the calm, letting go of the tension that had built up in her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't thinking about the past or the future. She was simply present, walking beside Caleb, enjoying the quiet peace of the moment. They found a secluded bench near the edge of the park, shaded by the trees, where the hustle of the world around them seemed to fall away. Sophie sat down first, and Caleb followed, sitting close enough that their legs brushed. The proximity felt natural, comforting. For a few moments, they were silent. Sophie didn't know what to say, and Caleb seemed content to simply be with her, his presence enough to fill the space between them. But there was something in the air, a quiet tension that hung over them, waiting to be addressed. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice low and careful. "I don't want to make you feel pressured, Sophie, but I think we need to talk about what's happening between us." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and she turned her head to meet his gaze. There it was again, the unspoken truth, hanging between them like a heavy weight. "I don't want to rush anything," he continued, his eyes searching hers, "but I also don't want to hide how I feel. I care about you, Sophie, and I want to see where this goes." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had known it was coming, had felt the shift, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel so real. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words got stuck in her throat. It wasn't that she didn't want the same thing, because she did, with everything in her. It was just that the weight of the question made her unsure of what to say, how to navigate the path they were on. Caleb seemed to sense her hesitation. He reached out and gently took her hand in his, squeezing it reassuringly. It's okay if you're not ready to say anything right now. I just wanted you to know how I feel. And no matter what, I'm not going anywhere." Sophie's heart swelled at his words, the warmth of his hand in hers grounding her, steadying her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone in this. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "I care about you too, Caleb," she finally said, her voice soft but clear. I'm just scared. I don't want to mess this up." "You won't," Caleb said with a quiet certainty, his thumb brushing over her hand. "We'll figure it out together." The words hung in the air, and Sophie let them sink in, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. There was so much unknown, so much still to navigate. But in this moment, in the quiet of the park with Caleb by her side, Sophie knew one thing for sure. They were both ready to take the next step, whatever that might be. And for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt like the beginning of something real. Chapter 11. Chords of the Heart. The following days passed in a blur of small moments, shared glances, quiet conversations, and the unspoken connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Sophie found herself lost in the rhythm of it all, caught somewhere between uncertainty and the warmth of Caleb's presence. Every time they were together, it felt like a new chapter of something unfolding, but there was still that lingering question at the back of her mind. Where was this really going? It wasn't that she didn't care about him. On the contrary, she felt as though Caleb had become a part of her, slowly filling the empty spaces that had existed before. But Sophie wasn't someone who was used to this kind of uncertainty, this feeling of being suspended between two worlds. The one she had known for so long, and the one that Caleb was quietly, yet steadily, inviting her to explore. This afternoon, Sophie sat by her window, staring out at the street below. The world was bustling, as it always did, people hurrying to and fro, lost in their own thoughts. Yet in her apartment, there was a stillness that had settled over her, one that was hard to shake. She felt restless, unable to focus on anything for too long. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Caleb, his words, his touch, the way he made her feel like she wasn't alone, even in the quietest of moments. But it was more than that. It was the way he seemed to understand her, as though he saw something in her that she herself didn't fully recognize. The connection between them was undeniable, but still, there were things left unsaid, moments that had passed without being fully explored. Sophie wanted to know more, wanted to dive deeper into the feelings that were beginning to surface, but she wasn't sure how to bring it up, how to take that next step without pushing too hard, without revealing too much. She was lost in her thoughts when her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her reverie. Her heart gave a small jolt as she saw Caleb's name on the screen. "Hey, I was thinking about you. Do you want to meet up this evening? I know a quiet place we could go." A smile tugged at the corners of Sophie's lips as she quickly typed back, "I'd love that. I'll be ready." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she added a second message. "I'm looking forward to seeing you." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, the flutter of excitement in her chest growing with each passing moment. She had grown so accustomed to their quiet time together, those moments of soft conversation and comfortable silence. But this evening, something felt different. It was as though both of them were on the brink of something, as if the next few hours might bring the answers to all the questions that had been lingering between them. When Caleb arrived later that evening, Sophie was already waiting, her coat draped over her shoulders as she stood in the hallway, her heart beating faster at the thought of spending more time with him. She opened the door to find him standing there, his expression warm, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Hey," Caleb greeted her softly, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. There was an intensity in his eyes tonight, something different than the easygoing affection he usually wore. "Hi," Sophie replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. I'm ready. Caleb smiled, the edges of his lips curling upward, and motioned for her to follow him. They stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights twinkling around them like stars in the distance. There was something magical about the way the world felt at night, as though everything was quieter, more intimate. They walked in silence for a while, side by side, the distance between them closing with each step. Sophie couldn't help but notice the subtle way Caleb's hand brushed against hers as they walked, a gentle reminder that they were together, that this was real. As they reached their destination, a small cafe tucked away on a quiet side street, Sophie felt her nerves rise. The cafe had a rustic charm, its walls lined with bookshelves and soft lighting that made everything feel warm and inviting. It wasn't the kind of place where people gathered in crowds, but rather a place for quiet conversation, for moments of introspection. Caleb led her to a small table by the window, and they sat down across from one another, the ambient noise of the cafe fading into the background. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a tension in the air, a stillness that Sophie wasn't sure how to navigate. So, Caleb began, breaking the silence, his voice soft but full of meaning. I've been thinking about us. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. What about us? He hesitated, his hand resting on the table, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. I guess I'm wondering if we're ready for what comes next. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sophie felt the weight of it, the truth of it, but she wasn't sure how to respond. What did ready even mean? Was anyone ever truly ready for something this real, this deep? She opened her mouth to speak, but found that the words didn't come. I don't want to rush things, but, Caleb continued, his voice trailing off as though he, too, was unsure how to put his feelings into words. I don't want to let this slip away without knowing what it really means. Sophie swallowed, her throat dry. She could feel the walls inside her starting to crumble, the hesitation and uncertainty that had been building between them slowly giving way to something else. A quiet longing, a desire to move forward, to take that next step even though she wasn't sure where it would lead. I think I feel the same way, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what it all means yet, but I know that I don't want to let go of this. There was a silence between them then, a quiet understanding that settled in the space between their words. They didn't need to explain everything. They didn't need to define it all. What mattered was the simple truth of it. They were in this together, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Caleb smiled, a slow, genuine smile that made Sophie's heart skip a beat. I'm glad you feel that way, he said, his voice filled with warmth. We'll figure it out, Sophie. Together. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie believed him. Whatever came next, whatever questions were left unanswered, whatever doubts lingered between them, she knew one thing for certain. They were ready to face it, together. Chapter 12. The Melody Between Us. Sophie woke up to a morning that felt different. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft, golden rays across the room. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel possible, as though the weight of the world had been lifted, leaving only the promise of something new. But even with the peace that surrounded her, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of something shifting inside her. A quiet storm brewing, threatening to break. She sat up in bed, the sheets still warm from the night before, her mind racing as it often did in the stillness of early mornings. The conversation with Caleb the night before had left her with more questions than answers. They had spoken about where they stood, about moving forward together, but Sophie couldn't help but wonder if she was truly ready for what that meant. Caleb had been so open, so willing to share his feelings, but Sophie wasn't sure how to articulate her own. It wasn't that she didn't care for him. Far from it. She had never felt so connected to someone in her life. Every touch, every glance, every quiet moment they shared seemed to solidify the bond between them. But something still held her back. A fear she couldn't quite name. A hesitation she couldn't shake. She stood up, pacing around the apartment, trying to focus on anything other than the uncertainty that gnawed at her. The days with Caleb had been nothing short of wonderful. There was a tenderness in his touch, a softness in his words that made her feel like she had finally found a place where she could belong. But the more they spent time together, the more she realized how much of herself she still kept hidden, how much of her heart she wasn't ready to give. Sophie ran a hand through her hair and made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself a cup of coffee, letting the warmth of the liquid seep into her hands as she stared out the window, lost in thought. She had never been one to hold back, to keep things inside. But with Caleb, it was different. Every time she thought about opening up, about saying the words that were lodged in her throat, fear would hold her back. What if she wasn't ready? What if this connection between them wasn't enough? Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Caleb. "Good morning, Sophie. I was wondering if you're free later. I have something I'd like to talk to you about." Sophie's heart skipped a beat at the message. She had known this moment would come, the moment when they would have to face the truth of what they were building together. But even so, the weight of it made her feel suddenly overwhelmed. What did Caleb want to talk about? Had something changed? Was he having second thoughts? She stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed a response. "Good morning, Caleb. I'm free. What's on your mind?" The reply came quickly. "I'll pick you up in an hour. I think it's time we had that conversation, don't you?" Sophie's stomach twisted with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. She knew this was inevitable, this moment when the silence between them would finally have to be broken. But even as the uncertainty bubbled inside her, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. The connection that seemed to tie them together in ways words couldn't fully capture. She had no idea what would come next, but one thing was certain. She couldn't hide from this anymore. An hour later, Caleb arrived at her door, his usual smile on his face. But there was something different in his eyes, something more serious, more intent. He greeted her with a gentle kiss on the cheek, but Sophie could feel the weight of his presence, the unspoken tension between them. "Ready?" Caleb asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something deeper. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she followed him out the door. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space between them, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder where they were headed. She didn't ask, not yet. She knew Caleb would speak when he was ready. They pulled up to a quiet park near the edge of town, a place Sophie had never been before. The trees were tall and dense, their branches swaying in the gentle breeze. The park was nearly empty, save for a few people walking their dogs or sitting on benches, lost in their own thoughts. It felt like the perfect place for a conversation that needed to happen, away from the distractions of the world. Caleb parked the car and turned to Sophie, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "Sophie," he began, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity, "I've been thinking a lot about what we've talked about recently. About us." Sophie's heart stuttered in her chest, and she nodded, urging him to continue. "There's something I need to tell you," Caleb said, his voice quiet but certain. "And I need you to know that this isn't easy for me, but I want you to understand where I'm coming from." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The tension in the air was thick now, and she could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what he was about to say, but she knew it was important. She waited, her heart racing. "I think we both know that what we have is special," Caleb continued, his eyes locking onto hers. "And I don't want to let fear or uncertainty stand in the way of that. But I also know that we can't keep skating around the hard parts. We need to be honest with each other. About what we want, about where this is going. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. This was it. This was the moment that everything changed. She had known it was coming, but the reality of it was overwhelming. She nodded, her throat dry, unable to find the words to speak. I care about you, Sophie, Caleb said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. But I need to know that you're as ready for this as I am. I can't keep pouring myself into something if you're holding back, if you're not sure about what we're building together. Sophie swallowed hard, her eyes welling up with emotion. She hadn't realized just how much she had been holding back, how much of her heart she had been keeping hidden. But Caleb was right. They couldn't keep dancing around the truth. They needed to face it together. I am, Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm ready. I just needed to be sure. Caleb reached across the seat, taking her hand gently in his. We'll figure it out, Sophie. Together. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She wasn't alone in this. Caleb was there, and for the first time, she was ready to let go of her fear and embrace whatever came next. Chapter 13. Fractured Harmonies. The days that followed their conversation in the park seemed to stretch out before Sophie like an endless horizon. Each one felt both familiar and new, as though she were seeing her world through a different lens, clearer, sharper, yet somehow more fragile. She and Caleb had crossed an invisible line that neither of them had been able to identify until that moment. But now that it had been crossed, Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of it settling in, as if the silence between them had shifted into something more profound, more important. After that day, they spent more time together than ever before, yet it wasn't always the same. There were still moments of easy laughter, of shared meals and stolen glances. But there were also moments of quiet introspection, times when both of them seemed to be processing the implications of what they had said, of what they were trying to build. Sophie often found herself wondering if Caleb, too, felt the same uncertainty creeping in. The moments between them were no longer just comfortable. They were charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and unsettling. Sophie had always prided herself on being able to articulate her thoughts, to untangle the knots of her emotions with words. But with Caleb, things felt different. She didn't want to speak just for the sake of speaking. She didn't want to fill the space between them with empty phrases. She wanted to be sure, to be honest with herself before she opened her mouth. And yet, there were times when the silence grew too loud, too heavy, when she needed to know, needed to understand where they stood. It was late one evening when Sophie found herself standing at her kitchen window, staring out at the city lights that flickered like tiny stars in the distance. Her thoughts were scattered, drifting from one worry to the next, and for the first time in days, she felt a deep unease settle in her chest. Caleb had been quieter lately, more reserved, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The certainty she had felt when they first spoke about their future together had been replaced with a lingering doubt. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed to talk to him. They needed to talk, really talk, about what was happening between them, about where they were headed. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Caleb. Hey, are you free tonight? I was thinking we could grab a drink or something, just to talk. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. There it was. He had been feeling it too. The unspoken tension, the need to address whatever was hanging between them. She quickly typed a reply. I'd like that. I'll be ready in a bit. The brief exchange did little to calm the storm brewing inside her, but it was a step. It was a sign that Caleb, too, was ready to face whatever was uncertain between them. When Caleb arrived, Sophie was already waiting by the door. She greeted him with a soft smile, though she could feel the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Caleb seemed different tonight, quieter, almost withdrawn. He met her gaze with a look that was both affectionate and apprehensive, as if he, too, was unsure of how to begin. "Shall we?" he asked, offering her his arm in a gesture that felt familiar but somehow distant. Sophie nodded, and they stepped out into the cool night air, the city around them alive with the hum of life. But despite the bustle of the world, Sophie felt as though she and Caleb were in their own bubble, separated from everyone else, suspended in a space that was all their own. They walked in silence for a while, side by side, neither of them speaking, both of them seemingly lost in their thoughts. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Sophie could feel Caleb's presence next to her, could hear the soft rhythm of his steps, but there was a distance between them that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't the physical space. It was something deeper, something that had yet to be addressed. They arrived at a small bar, dimly lit and intimate, the kind of place that invited quiet conversation. They found a table near the back, away from the noise of the crowd, and sat down. Caleb ordered a drink for both of them, and as the glasses were placed in front of them, they fell into a heavy silence once more. Sophie felt the tension in the air, thick and palpable. She could see it in the way Caleb's fingers drummed lightly against his glass, in the way his gaze shifted away from hers every time she looked up. She knew he was waiting for her to speak, just as much as she was waiting for him to break the silence. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb," she began, her throat tight with emotion. "What's going on between us?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment, Sophie saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Something raw, something real. It made her heart ache. "I don't know," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his own uncertainty. "I thought I had it figured out. I thought I knew where we were headed. But lately, I've been feeling lost." Sophie's chest tightened. She didn't want to hear that. She didn't want to feel like they were drifting apart, but there it was, the truth, hanging in the air between them. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to reassure him when she wasn't even sure of her own feelings. "I don't want to lose this," Caleb continued, his voice low and hesitant. "But I don't know how to move forward if we're both holding back." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She had been holding back. She knew that now. She had been afraid to let herself fully embrace what they had, afraid to step into the unknown because of everything that could go wrong. But now, listening to Caleb's words, she realized that she couldn't keep living in that fear. Not if she wanted this, wanted them, to work. "I've been holding back too," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been afraid of what comes next, afraid of what it all means. But I don't want to let fear control me anymore. I want this, Caleb. I want us." Caleb's eyes softened, and for the first time that night, a small, hopeful smile tugged at his lips. "Then let's stop holding back," he said quietly. "Let's take the next step together." And in that moment, Sophie knew that whatever the future held, they would face it as a team. The silence between them was no longer something to be afraid of. It was just a space waiting to be filled with the words that mattered most. Chapter 14. The Quiet Rebellion. The weeks that followed their conversation felt like a delicate dance between hope and fear. Sophie and Caleb had opened the door to something new between them. A deeper understanding, a shared vulnerability that both exhilarated and terrified them. But despite their efforts, there was still something unsaid, something lingering between them that neither of them had fully confronted. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't the uncomfortable kind that filled the spaces between their words, the kind that weighed down on them and kept them apart. It was a silence of understanding, a quiet agreement that they had crossed a threshold together and that now, they had to walk forward into whatever came next. And yet, Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of their unspoken truths. the things they hadn't fully acknowledged, hovering just beyond their reach. It was a Sunday morning when Sophie found herself standing in her living room, her gaze fixed on the window as she watched the early morning light filter through the trees outside. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt like it could stretch on forever if she allowed it. But her mind wouldn't let her rest. She had always been the type to face her emotions head-on, to confront what was difficult rather than hide from it. But with Caleb, everything felt more complicated. They had come so far, and yet Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly laid everything out in the open. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Caleb. "Good morning, Sophie. Are you free today? I'd like to talk." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. She had known this moment was coming, the moment when they would have to face the unspoken truths between them. She couldn't put it off any longer. "I'm free. I'll be ready in a bit," she typed back, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. The uncertainty that had settled in her chest in recent days seemed to grow with each passing moment. A few hours later, Caleb arrived at her apartment, his expression as serious as it had been the night they'd talked at the bar. He greeted her with a soft smile, but there was something about the way he looked at her, something that told Sophie this conversation was not going to be easy. They didn't speak as they walked to his car, the air between them thick with anticipation. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it was a heavy one, filled with the weight of everything they still hadn't said. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car. Sophie kept her gaze on the road ahead, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what Caleb wanted to talk about, but the feeling in the pit of her stomach told her that it had something to do with the underlying tension that had crept into their relationship. When they arrived at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place they had visited together a few times before, Caleb parked the car and turned to her. His eyes held a seriousness she hadn't seen before. "Sophie," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. The way we've been moving forward, about what we want from each other. And I think it's time we finally talk about what's really going on between us." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had known this conversation was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't expected. She nodded, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she waited for him to continue. "I know we've both been afraid of opening up completely," Caleb said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We've talked about the future, about what we want, but I don't think we've fully confronted the truth about where we are. We've been living in this in-between space, Sophie, and I think it's time we decided what we're really doing here." Sophie's heart raced as she listened to him, the words sinking in slowly. She knew exactly what he meant. They had been skirting around the deeper issues, not fully addressing the fears and doubts that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface. She had been afraid to acknowledge them herself, unsure of how Caleb would react or whether their relationship could survive the weight of those truths. "I'm not saying we have to have all the answers right now," Caleb continued, his gaze softening as he reached across the table to take her hand. "But I think we need to be honest with each other, about where we are, about what we want, about the things that scare us." Sophie looked at him, her chest tightening as she felt the depth of his words. She had been holding back, she realized. She had been afraid to speak the truth because she didn't know how Caleb would react, didn't know if he would still want her once everything was out in the open. But sitting across from him now, Sophie realized that the only way forward was to face those fears together. "I've been scared too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of what comes next, of what we're building. I don't know if I'm ready to give all of myself to someone again, to trust that what we have will last." Caleb's expression softened, and he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers, Sophie. I'm not asking you to be ready for everything right now. but I need you to know that I'm here. I want to figure this out with you, no matter what it takes." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, her heart aching as she realized the depth of Caleb's commitment. He wasn't asking for perfection, for certainty. He was asking for honesty, for the chance to build something real. And in that moment, Sophie knew that she couldn't keep holding back. Not from him, not from herself. "I want this, Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I want to build something real with you, but I need to let go of my fear first. I need to trust that we can do this together." Caleb smiled, a small, warm smile that reached his eyes. "We'll do it together, Sophie, no matter what." And as they sat there, their hands entwined, Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The unspoken truths had been spoken aloud, and for the first time in a long while, she felt free. Free to embrace what was happening between them, free to build something new without the fear of the unknown holding her back. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would still be moments of doubt, moments when the silence between them would feel heavy. But Sophie knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that was all she needed to move forward. Chapter 15. A Song Without a Voice. The weeks that followed their conversation at the cafe felt like a time of quiet transformation. Sophie and Caleb had stepped into uncharted territory, a space between them where the weight of their fears, doubts, and desires seemed to shift with each passing day. They no longer tiptoed around the unspoken, but instead spoke openly, vulnerably, about what they wanted, about what they feared. There was a rawness to their connection now, a deeper, truer understanding of each other that made everything feel both more fragile and more powerful. For Sophie, it was a revelation. She had never realized how much she had kept locked inside, how much of herself she had buried beneath layers of uncertainty. With Caleb, though, she felt a kind of freedom she hadn't known before. He didn't ask her to be perfect. He only asked for her honesty, for her willingness to meet him halfway. But even as their bond deepened, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there were still places within her that she hadn't fully explored. There were still fears and dreams, hopes and regrets that she hadn't shared with Caleb. The silence between them, though no longer uncomfortable, remained. Like an open space that invited further connection, but also reminded her that there was still more to be said. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Sophie found herself sitting on the balcony of her apartment, gazing out at the city skyline. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a soft glow that bathed the buildings in golden light. She had always found comfort in the stillness of twilight, in the way the world seemed to pause, holding its breath before the night settled in. But tonight, the stillness felt different. She had been restless all day, her thoughts spinning around the same question. How much of herself was she still hiding? How much had she allowed Caleb to see, and how much was she still keeping locked away? Sophie had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone to complete her. But with Caleb, things had shifted. She didn't feel incomplete in his presence. Rather, she felt as though she was discovering parts of herself that had long been dormant. She wanted to share those parts with him, but there was a hesitation within her, a fear of being too vulnerable, of showing him the parts of herself that she had kept hidden for so long. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Caleb. "I was thinking about you. Are you free tonight?" Her heart skipped a beat. The simplicity of his words, the tenderness behind them, made Sophie smile. He had been doing that more often lately. Reaching out, checking in, letting her know he was thinking of her. It was something small, but it meant everything. "Always," she replied, her fingers dancing across the screen as she typed. "I'll be ready in a bit." When Caleb arrived, Sophie greeted him with a smile, though she could feel the unease still lingering within her. She led him out to the balcony, the cool evening air wrapping around them as they settled into their usual spots. Caleb reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady, and for a moment, Sophie allowed herself to relax, to lean into the comfort of his presence. But the quiet that settled between them felt different tonight. There was a weight to it, an unspoken tension that Sophie couldn't ignore. She knew they were both trying to navigate this space between them, trying to figure out what came next. But Sophie still hadn't fully let go of her fear, her hesitation. It lingered just beneath the surface, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Sophie," he said, his voice low but gentle. "I know we've been talking a lot about where we're headed, about what we want. But I need to ask you something." He turned to face her, his gaze searching, as if trying to gauge her reaction. Sophie felt her pulse quicken, her heart picking up speed. She knew what was coming, and yet she wasn't sure if she was ready to answer it. "What are you afraid of?" Caleb asked, his voice soft but steady. "What's holding you back from letting me in completely?" The question hit her like a wave, crashing over her with an intensity that left her breathless. She had known it was coming. She had known that eventually Caleb would ask her to confront the one thing she had been avoiding. The fear that had kept her at arm's length, the fear that still prevented her from fully embracing what they had. Sophie began, her throat tight. She tried to find the words, tried to put the swirling thoughts into something coherent, but the truth felt elusive, like something too fragile to grasp. "I don't want to lose myself," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so afraid of losing myself in someone else, of letting go of who I am in order to be with you. I know it sounds silly, but it's been so hard to let myself need someone, to let someone in." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He just held her gaze, as though waiting for her to continue, waiting for her to say whatever was still left unsaid. "I've spent so long convincing myself that I don't need anyone, that I can be okay on my own," Sophie continued, her words tumbling out now, the dam finally breaking. "But with you, Caleb, I feel like I'm falling into something I don't fully understand. And I'm scared. I'm scared of losing myself in it, of losing the parts of me that make me who I am." Caleb's expression softened, and he moved closer, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Sophie," he said softly, "I'm not asking you to lose yourself. I'm asking you to share yourself with me. I don't want you to become someone you're not. I just want to know you. All of you. I want us to grow together, not apart." Sophie felt the weight of his words settle deep inside her. The truth was simple, yet profound. She had been so focused on the fear of losing herself that she hadn't fully understood that being with someone didn't mean giving up who she was. It meant sharing who she was, letting another person see her, and trusting them to love her in all her complexity. "I'm still learning how to do that," Sophie admitted, her voice shaky but sincere. "I don't have all the answers, but I want to try. I want to trust you with the parts of me that I've kept hidden." Caleb smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made Sophie's heart swell. "Then that's all I need, Sophie. We'll figure it out together. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to try." And in that moment, Sophie realized that the space between them wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. It was the space where they could both grow, both learn, both become something more than they had been before. The silence between them wasn't the absence of connection. It was the space where the most important conversations were happening, the space where they were learning to trust, to love, and to truly see each other. Chapter 16. The Symphony Within. The days following their conversation felt like an intricate dance. One step forward, 2 steps back, but the rhythm was beginning to feel natural. Sophie and Caleb had reached a place where the walls between them had softened. There was still hesitation, still a carefulness in how they navigated their shared space. But there was also a tenderness, a willingness to let go of their fears and trust in what was unfolding between them. For Sophie, it had been a week of revelation. She had never fully realized how much her fears had shaped her life, how much she had guarded herself from truly opening up to someone. But now, with Caleb, she felt a pull towards something deeper, something real. It wasn't just the connection between them. It was the sense of peace she felt when he was near, the way he could make her feel understood without saying a word. It was a comfort she hadn't known she was missing. Yet, despite the progress they had made, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to be uncovered. The silence between them was no longer a void, but it wasn't completely filled either. It had become a space of quiet understanding, a place where they could exist together without the need for constant words. But that didn't mean the silence was easy. It was still a space where doubts, old fears, and unspoken questions lingered, just out of reach. Sophie found herself standing at her kitchen counter one evening, her hands absently stirring a cup of tea, her mind adrift. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this moment of stillness until she found herself caught in it. The tea had cooled, forgotten in her hands, as her thoughts wandered back to Caleb and their growing connection. The truth was, she was beginning to feel the weight of something that she hadn't fully faced. It wasn't just the fear of losing herself. It was the fear of needing someone so much that she couldn't imagine life without them. It was the vulnerability of relying on someone else, of trusting that they would be there when the world seemed too heavy to carry alone. Sophie's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Caleb. "I've been thinking about you," the message read. "I know we've talked a lot, but there's something I want to ask. Can we meet up tonight?" Her heart quickened as she read the message, the familiar flutter of anticipation stirring within her. She had known something was coming. There was a stillness between them lately, a quiet that felt like it was building to something important. "Of course," she replied, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "I'll be ready when you are." By the time Caleb arrived, it was already dark. The night air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of the coming rain. Sophie greeted him with a soft smile, her heart pounding a little faster than she expected. They walked together to his car in silence, but it was no longer the heavy silence of before. It was the kind of quiet that made her feel grounded, as though they both understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. They drove to a nearby park, a quiet place where the city's noise seemed miles away. The park was nearly empty, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze, their branches creaking as if in conversation with the wind. It was here, in the heart of the stillness, that Caleb pulled the car to a stop. "I've been thinking," he said, turning to face Sophie. His eyes were soft, almost uncertain, but there was a steadiness to his gaze that made Sophie's pulse quicken. "I know we've come a long way, Sophie, but there's something I need to understand. Something I think we need to face." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, had known that Caleb would eventually need to ask her the questions she had been avoiding herself. The weight of the conversation felt heavy in the air between them, but it was a weight she welcomed. This was the point where they would either move forward together or stay trapped in the same patterns that had held them both back. "What is it?" Sophie asked, her voice steady but laced with a thread of tension. Caleb hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been wondering," he began, his voice quieter now, "if we're both really ready for this, for everything that comes with being in this, whatever it is between us. It's easy to get lost in the idea of what we could be, but I need to know if we're both willing to put in the work, to face what's going to come up along the way." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had known this conversation was inevitable, had known that at some point they would have to confront the reality of their connection. She had been afraid to face it, but now that it was here, she found herself drawn to the clarity of Caleb's words. "Are you asking if I'm ready to be with you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's gaze softened, and he nodded. I'm asking if you're ready to build something real, Sophie. To let go of the things that are holding you back and trust in what we can be together. Sophie sat back in her seat, her hands resting in her lap as she considered his words. It wasn't a simple question. The answer was complicated, layered with all the fear and hesitation she had carried with her for so long. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't ready to lose him. She wasn't ready to walk away from the possibility of something real, something lasting, no matter how terrifying it was. I don't know if I'm completely ready, she admitted, her voice low, but I know I want to try. I want to build something with you, Caleb. I just don't want to lose myself in the process. Caleb reached over and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to lose yourself, Sophie. I'm not asking you to change. I'm just asking you to trust me, to trust us. Her heart swelled at his words, the truth of them settling deep inside her. She had spent so long guarding herself, keeping her distance, but now she was willing to let go of the fear that had held her back. She was willing to trust, not just Caleb, but herself. Trust that she could build something real, something beautiful, without losing who she was along the way. And as they sat there, in the stillness of the night, Sophie realized that the silence between them wasn't an obstacle. It was the space in which they were learning to grow, to understand each other, to build a future that was entirely their own. Chapter 17. The Bridge of Understanding. The weeks that followed their conversation in the park felt like a quiet unraveling, a shedding of old layers, a deepening of their connection that, though imperceptible at times, seemed to shift the very air between Sophie and Caleb. There was something peaceful about the way they had settled into each other's lives, as if their presence had become a part of the other's rhythm, like two songs harmonizing in perfect balance. Sophie had grown accustomed to the steady warmth of Caleb's companionship. He no longer felt like a possibility. He was there, present in ways that felt real and lasting. It was a comfort she had never known, but it also left her grappling with a quiet uncertainty that she hadn't fully anticipated. The more she allowed herself to rely on him, the more she realized how much of herself had been shaped by fear. The fear of needing someone, of letting someone else see her in all her vulnerability. She had spent so much of her life perfecting the art of solitude, of convincing herself that independence was all she needed. But with Caleb, it was different. She didn't feel incomplete. She felt whole in a way she never had before. And yet, there was still that lingering doubt, like a thread she couldn't quite pull free, that perhaps she was letting too much of herself be defined by their relationship. It was on a rainy evening in mid-November when Sophie first noticed it. The silence that had once felt so comfortable now felt thick, like something unsaid hung between them. It wasn't a silence born of ease, but of something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. They had been spending more time together lately, slipping into the kind of routine where shared moments felt both familiar and new. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb was holding something back. The rain pelted against the windows of Sophie's apartment, a soft but constant sound that made the room feel warmer, more intimate. Caleb sat across from her at the small kitchen table, the glow from the lamps casting shadows across his face. He was absorbed in a book, but Sophie could sense the weight of his thoughts, the subtle tension in his posture. It was in the way his jaw tightened every time he turned a page, in the way his fingers lingered over the corners of the paper. Sophie watched him for a long moment, the feeling of disconnection creeping in despite their proximity. There was something there, something she couldn't reach, but it felt important to address. She set her tea down, the cup lightly clinking against the ceramic saucer, and looked at him. "Caleb," she began, her voice tentative but firm. "Is everything okay?" His eyes flickered up to meet hers, a flash of something unreadable crossing his face before he masked it with a smile. Yeah, of course. Why? Sophie tilted her head, studying him more closely. You've been distant lately. I don't know how to explain it, but I can feel that something's different. There was a moment of hesitation. Caleb's eyes softened, but there was something guarded in them now, something Sophie hadn't seen before. He closed the book slowly, the movement deliberate, as if he were giving careful thought to what he was about to say. I've been thinking a lot, he admitted, his voice low, about everything, about us. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling just slightly. I think we're both in a place where things are changing, Sophie. We've both opened up to each other, and that's a good thing. But it's also scary. For me, anyway. I'm not always sure how to navigate this, or how much I should be giving. The words struck Sophie like a chord, resonating in a way she hadn't expected. She had known that Caleb was struggling with something, but hearing it so plainly, so openly, left her with a bittersweet understanding. This was the silence that had been building between them. The kind of quiet that wasn't just a lack of noise but a reflection of something deeper, something unresolved. I understand, she said softly, though her heart ached with the weight of it. I've been feeling the same way. I don't want to push you or make you feel like you have to give more than you're ready for. Caleb's gaze met hers again, and for the first time in a while, Sophie saw the vulnerability in his eyes. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch steady but gentle. Sophie, I don't want to hold back from you. I really don't. But I think part of me is scared. Scared of getting too close, of letting myself need you in ways that I haven't allowed myself to need anyone before. Sophie's chest tightened as she listened, her heart aching with the realization that their struggles weren't so different after all. She had been afraid of losing herself in the quiet, in the space between them, but Caleb was afraid of letting himself need her in the same way. I don't want you to feel like you have to hold back, she said, her voice soft but firm. I want to be here for you, to let you in. But I need you to trust me, Caleb. I need you to trust that we can handle this together. There was a long pause as Caleb processed her words. Finally, he nodded, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. I do trust you, Sophie. It's just hard, but I'm willing to try. I just need you to understand that I'm still figuring this out, too. Sophie smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. She had feared that their connection would be marred by unspoken fears, but hearing Caleb's admission brought her a sense of clarity. They were both learning, both growing, both trying to figure out how to navigate the complexity of what they had together. It wasn't easy, but it was real. I understand, she said softly, her thumb brushing over his knuckles in a gentle, reassuring motion. And I'm here, Caleb. We're in this together. The weight of the silence between them began to lift, replaced by something more tangible, an understanding, a shared commitment to move forward despite the uncertainties that still lingered. It was a quiet, unspoken promise that no matter what, they would continue to face whatever came their way. As the rain continued to fall outside, Sophie felt a sense of peace settle over her. The silence was no longer something to fear, but a space in which they could both breathe, both learn, both grow. It was a space where their love was being tested, but also where it was being forged, stronger and more resilient with each passing moment. Chapter 18, A Silent Encore. The passage of time had a way of softening the sharp edges of uncertainty. Weeks had slipped by, marked by subtle changes in the way Sophie and Caleb moved through the world together. Their conversations were no longer weighed down by the heavy silence that had once separated them. Instead, they had found a rhythm, an unspoken understanding that allowed them to exist together without the pressure of constant words. But beneath this surface of quiet intimacy, Sophie could feel the currents shifting, pulling them in new directions. It was late on a Thursday evening when Sophie found herself sitting alone on the balcony of her apartment, a soft blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the distant skyline. The city lights flickered in the distance, a sea of soft glows that seemed to stretch on forever. There was something about the vastness of it all that both calmed and unsettled her. The night was still, the only sounds the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hum of traffic. She had come to the balcony to think, to give herself space to breathe, and to sort through the thoughts that had been lingering in her mind. Caleb had left earlier that evening, after a quiet dinner and a long, comfortable conversation about nothing and everything at once. He had kissed her on the cheek before he left, his touch soft, as if reassuring her that no matter the distance between them, they were still connected. And yet, despite the warmth of his presence, Sophie found herself drifting back into that space of uncertainty. There was a distance between them now, not the kind of physical space that could be measured by inches or miles, but the kind that arose from unspoken questions, from the weight of the things they had not yet said. She could sense it in the way Caleb's smile sometimes didn't quite reach his eyes, in the way he would pause before responding, as though searching for the right words, or perhaps struggling to find them at all. She shifted her gaze from the cityscape to the sky above, where the first stars had begun to appear, tiny pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. There was something about the night that felt infinite, like the quiet had its own rhythm, its own pulse that could draw out the truth if one was willing to listen closely enough. Sophie closed her eyes and took a deep breath, allowing the cool air to fill her lungs. She had been wondering, for a while now, what Caleb was really thinking, what was happening in the quiet spaces between their conversations. They had both let their guard down, in different ways, but the walls of protection they had built over the years weren't so easily dismantled. Sophie had been slowly learning to trust him, to trust in the quiet they shared. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to their connection, more to Caleb's heart that she wasn't seeing. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Sophie pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Caleb's name on the screen. A small smile tugged at her lips before she answered. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, the cool night air mingling with the warmth of his voice. "Hi," Caleb replied, his voice low and warm, as it always was. "I was thinking about you." Sophie's chest tightened, the warmth of his words sending a flutter through her. "I was thinking about you, too." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sophie felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Caleb's voice, when it came, was hesitant, almost unsure. "I've been meaning to ask you something. Something that's been on my mind." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She leaned forward, the edge of the balcony pressing against her legs, her fingers gripping the railing as if steadying herself. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep the unease from creeping into her voice. "Do you ever wonder what's next for us?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I know we're still figuring things out, but I can't help but think about what comes after all this quiet. After we've shared all the things we've been hiding, after we've both gotten used to just being together. What happens when we've reached the point where silence isn't enough anymore?" Sophie's heart beat in her ears, the weight of his words sinking deep inside her. She had wondered the same thing, though she hadn't allowed herself to voice it, hadn't allowed herself to entertain the thought. What happened when the quiet between them stopped feeling like a comfortable space and became something that left them yearning for more? "I don't know," Sophie admitted, her voice soft but steady. "I guess part of me is afraid of that. Afraid of what happens when we've said everything we can say, when we've both opened up and we're still left with the unknown. I don't want to lose the simplicity of what we have, Caleb. I don't want the quiet to turn into something we can't navigate." Caleb was silent for a long time, and Sophie wondered if he was searching for the right words, or if he, too, was feeling the weight of their unspoken fears. "I don't want to lose it, either," Caleb finally said, his voice gentle, as though he were carefully choosing his words. "But I think we need to let it grow, Sophie. We can't stay in the silence forever. It's a beautiful space, but we have to keep moving forward, even if it's uncertain. Even if we don't have all the answers right now." Sophie closed her eyes, the truth of his words settling over her like a quiet understanding. She had spent so long trying to preserve the quiet, trying to keep the distance between them from growing too wide. But maybe the quiet wasn't something to be preserved. Maybe it was something to be used as a foundation, as a starting point, for something more. "I'm willing to try," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I'm willing to move forward with you, even if it's uncertain, even if we don't know what comes next." There was a long pause before Caleb responded, and when he did, his voice was filled with a quiet certainty that sent a ripple of warmth through Sophie's chest. "Then we'll figure it out together. No matter what, Sophie, we'll figure it out." And in that moment, as the city stretched on beneath her and the stars twinkled above, Sophie realized that the silence between them wasn't something to fear. It was simply the space in which they were learning to exist together, to understand each other, to build something that was as real as the quiet they shared.